Daniel Whitehorse stood in chains before the Council of Assembled Species, and his heart pounded like drums in his chest. The chamber around him glowed with lights he had never seen before, and the air hummed with a sound that made his bones ache. He was a simple man from the mountains of North Carolina, and he had spent his whole life hunting deer and tracking animals through the forests his ancestors had walked for thousands of years. 3 months ago, he'd been following a deer trail through the Great Smoky Mountains when the sky opened up and swallowed him whole. Now he stood in a place that was not Earth and faced creatures that were not human, and listened to words that spoke of his death. The aliens called themselves the Council of Assembled Species, and they represented hundreds of worlds across the galaxy. They looked nothing like the people Daniel had known his whole life. Some were tall and made of something like liquid metal that flowed and changed shape as they moved. Others looked like insects but stood upright and wore clothing made of materials that shifted colors. There were beings made of pure light that hurt to look at directly, and creatures that seemed to be made of living crystal that chimed softly when they moved. Daniel had stopped trying to understand what they were and focused only on staying alive. The leader of the council was called an arbiter, and it looked like mercury poured into the shape of a person. It spoke through a device that translated its words into English, and the voice made Daniel's teeth hurt and his head throb. The arbiter explained that humanity was classified as a Tier 7 primitive species, and that meant humans were barely worth studying. Daniel's presence on the station was considered contamination because primitives were not supposed to leave their worlds. The punishment for contamination was death by ritual incineration, and it would happen at dawn when the station's orbit brought them into view of the nearest star. Daniel listened to these words and felt fear rise in his throat like bile. He thought of his daughter Katie, who was 14 years old, and would never know what happened to her father. He thought of his brother Jacob, who had probably spent months searching the mountains for him. He thought of the smell of pine trees and the sound of morning birds and the feel of cold mountain water on his face. He did not want to die in this terrible place so far from home and so far from everything he loved. But Daniel's grandmother had taught him that a Cherokee warrior never begs for mercy without offering something in return. She had taught him that every person has value and every skill has purpose. She had taught him the old ways of hunting and healing and creating beauty from simple materials. So Daniel straightened his back despite the chains and spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. He told the council that they could burn him if they wanted, but they would be burning knowledge they did not possess. He told them he could hunt prey they could not track with all their machines and sensors. He told them he could heal wounds their advanced medicine failed to cure. He told them he could weave patterns their computers could not replicate. He told them that what they called primitive was actually wisdom they had forgotten in their rush toward technology. The council chamber filled with sounds that Daniel's translator device said were laughter. The beings found his words amusing, because how could a primitive human from a Tier 7 world possibly know anything useful? They had ships that could cross the galaxy in days. They had medicine that could cure diseases Daniel had never heard of. They had computers that could solve mathematical problems in seconds that would take human scientists years to complete. What could this simple hunter possibly teach them? But one voice spoke up from the crowd of aliens. Ambassador Krell represented something called the Shortened Days Alliance, and they were a group of species who believed that older civilizations should be studied rather than dismissed. Krell's species looked like tall, thin beings covered in fur that changed colors based on their emotions. Right now, Krell's fur was shifting between blue and green, which the translator said meant curiosity and interest. Krell demanded that Daniel be given a chance to prove his claims before being executed. The arbiter seemed annoyed by this interruption, but the rules of the council said that any member could call for a trial by demonstration. If Daniel could prove even one of his claims, then the council would have to reconsider his sentence. If he failed, then he would burn at dawn as originally planned. The arbiter asked Daniel which skill he wanted to demonstrate first, and Daniel thought carefully about his answer. Hunting was what he knew best, because he had spent his entire life in the forests. His father had taught him to track, and his grandfather had taught his father, and the knowledge went back generations to a time before Europeans had ever set foot in America. Daniel chose hunting as his first trial, and the council agreed to give him 3 days to complete a task they would set for him. The arbiter explained the challenge with what Daniel's translator suggested was smug satisfaction. The station's biodome contained a creature called a Zethian shadowstalker, and it was one of the most dangerous predators in the known galaxy. The creature had escaped from containment 6 weeks ago and had been hiding in the dome ever since. 3 professional hunting parties had tried to capture it, and all 3 had failed. The shadowstalker could blend into any environment and become completely invisible. It could phase through solid matter for brief moments, which meant normal traps were useless. It was fast and intelligent and had already injured 4 security officers who tried to catch it. Station security had recommended sealing off the entire dome and flooding it with poison gas, but the Arbiter had refused because the dome contained rare plants from dozens of worlds. If Daniel could capture the shadowstalker without destroying the dome, then the Council would consider his first claim proven. If he failed or died trying, then his execution would proceed as planned. The Arbiter gave Daniel until the 3rd dawn to complete his task. Daniel asked for supplies, and the Council agreed to provide basic materials. He requested cord and metal fragments and animal fat from the station's food processors. He asked for access to the dome's plant life and permission to move freely within the hunting area. The Council granted all his requests because they were certain he would fail. They saw him as a primitive human, with primitive tools facing a creature that represented the peak of predatory evolution. They expected to watch him die and then proceed with his execution, as a lesson to other species about respecting galactic law. But Daniel was not afraid because his grandmother had taught him that the best hunters do not rely on weapons alone. They rely on patience and observation and understanding. They learn the ways of their prey and think like their prey and become one with the environment. Daniel had hunted deer and bear and wild boar through mountains and forests where one mistake meant death. He had tracked animals through snow and rain and darkness. He had learned to read signs that others could not see and to move without sound and to wait without moving for hours. The shadowstalker was just another predator, and every predator had patterns. Every predator had needs and habits and weaknesses. Daniel would find those weaknesses and use them. He would prove to these aliens that human wisdom was worth more than they knew. He would save his life, and maybe, just maybe, he would change how the galaxy saw his people. The chains were removed from his wrists, and he was escorted to the biodome. His trial had begun. The biodome was massive and stretched so far in every direction that Daniel could barely see the walls through the thick vegetation. The ceiling curved high above him and showed a projection of alien stars that provided light like sunshine. The air was warm and humid and smelled of growing things mixed with scents Daniel did not recognize. Plants from dozens of worlds grew together in this artificial environment, and some were taller than earth trees, while others spread across the ground like carpet. The dome was beautiful, but it was also dangerous, and somewhere inside it lurked a predator that had defeated every attempt to capture it. Daniel stood at the entrance and simply watched for a long time. The aliens monitoring him through cameras grew impatient because they expected him to rush in and start searching. But Daniel's grandfather had taught him that hunting begins with observation, and a good hunter learns the land before tracking the prey. So he watched how the light moved through the plants and how the artificial wind caused leaves to rustle. He watched small creatures that looked like a cross between rabbits and lizards hop between bushes. He watched birds with 4 wings circle overhead and land on branches that bent under their weight. After an hour of watching, Daniel entered the dome and began walking slowly through the vegetation. He did not look for the shadowstalker because he knew he would not see it. Instead, he looked for signs of its passing. His grandmother had taught him that every creature leaves traces, and a skilled tracker can read those traces like words on a page. Daniel found scratch marks on tree bark where something large had climbed. He found droppings that were fresh and still warm. He found places where plants had been crushed by something moving through them in the night. The pattern began to emerge after several hours of careful searching. The shadowstalker was a creature of habit like most predators. It had established a territory in the northern section of the dome where the vegetation was thickest. It hunted the rabbit lizard creatures in the early morning and late evening. It rested during the brightest part of the day in elevated positions where it could watch for threats. It drank from a small stream that ran through the eastern edge of its territory. Daniel mapped all of this in his mind and began to understand his prey. On the second day, Daniel began gathering materials. He crushed berries from earth plants that had been included in the dome's collection and mixed them with water to create a dark paste. He used this paste to mark trees along the shadowstalker's hunting paths, but he marked them in places where only someone lying on the ground would see them. He fashioned snares from the cord he had been given, but instead of setting them where the creature walked, he set them where it would go if something startled it. He prepared metal fragments by sharpening them against rocks and coating them with animal fat mixed with crushed leaves that would mask human scent. The aliens watching through cameras grew more confused because nothing Daniel did seem to make sense. He was not building cages or traps that would hold a large predator. He was not setting up ambush points or using any kind of bait that would attract the creature. He seemed to be wandering randomly through the dome and marking trees and tying thin cord between branches. The council members who were monitoring the trial began to mock Daniel's methods, and several placed bets on how quickly he would fail. But Ambassador Krell watched more carefully than the others. Krell had studied human history since Daniel's capture, and had learned that humans approached problems differently than most species. Where galactic civilization relied on technology and direct solutions, humans often used indirect methods and patience. Krell noticed that Daniel was not trying to capture the Shadow Stalker at all. He was preparing the environment so that the creature would capture itself. On the third day, Daniel woke before dawn and moved to a position he had selected near the stream. He had not eaten much in 2 days because he wanted his body to be light and his senses sharp. He had rubbed himself with mud and crushed plants to mask his scent. He had practiced moving silently through the dome until he could walk within feet of the rabbit lizard creatures without startling them. Now he waited in perfect stillness as the artificial sun began to brighten the dome. The Shadow Stalker came to drink just as Daniel knew it would. He could not see it, but he could see the water rippling as something invisible disturbed the surface. He could hear the soft sound of lapping and the gentle crunch of leaves under invisible feet. Daniel remained perfectly still and watched the patterns in the water. He was not trying to see the creature itself, but rather to understand where it was and how it was moving. After the creature finished drinking, it would normally return to its resting place, through the thickest vegetation. But Daniel had prepared a surprise. He had collected the scent glands from several rabbit lizard creatures he had caught and released. He had placed these glands along an alternate path that would seem safer to the predator, because it was more concealed. The Shadow Stalker's instincts would draw it toward the stronger scent and the better cover. Daniel waited, and then he saw leaves moving in the pattern he expected. The creature was taking the bait. It moved slowly and carefully because even invisible predators knew to be cautious. It passed the first marker Daniel had set and then the second. It was moving exactly where Daniel needed it to go. He remained in position and controlled his breathing and waited for the perfect moment. The Shadow Stalker stepped onto a section of ground that Daniel had prepared with special care. The dirt here was loose and mixed with smooth pebbles that would shift under weight. The creature's paw sank slightly and the pebbles rolled, and this triggered a cascade of small movements. The creature instinctively jumped to the side to avoid what it perceived as unstable ground. This put it exactly where Daniel needed it to be. The creature phased through the first snare just as Daniel had expected. The aliens watching gasped because they thought Daniel's trap had failed. But Daniel had counted on the creature using its phasing ability. When a Zythian Shadow Stalker phased through solid matter, it had to become solid again within seconds or risk losing cohesion. Daniel had positioned his second trap not where the creature was, but where it would be when it solidified. The Shadow Stalker materialized directly in a net that Daniel had suspended, using the dome's artificial gravity fluctuations. He had learned that certain areas of the dome had slightly different gravity because of how the station's systems worked. By hanging his net in one of these areas and weighting it properly, he had created a trap that would collapse the moment something solid appeared inside it. The net wrapped around the creature and pulled tight, and suddenly the Shadow Stalker was visible because it could not maintain its camouflage while struggling. The creature thrashed and snarled and tried to phase again, but the net was coated with the animal fat mixture Daniel had prepared. This mixture contained compounds from plants that interfered with the Shadow Stalker's ability to control its molecular structure. Daniel had spent hours studying the dome's plant life and experimenting with different combinations until he found one that worked. It was not technology, and it was not something the aliens had ever considered because their solution to every problem was machines and computers. Daniel approached the trapped creature carefully because even caught it was dangerous. He spoke softly in Cherokee and used the calming tone his grandmother had taught him for dealing with frightened animals. He pulled out a small dart he had made from metal fragments and plant extracts. The aliens had told him that the Shadow Stalker was resistant to most tranquilizers, But Daniel had not made a tranquilizer. He had made a sedative using the same plants that grew in the dome because he reasoned that the creature had evolved alongside these plants and would be affected by them. He threw the dart and it struck the shadow stalker in the shoulder. The creature roared and struggled harder for a moment, but then its movements began to slow. The sedative was working because Daniel had guessed correctly about the plant's properties. Within minutes, the shadow stalker was unconscious and breathing steadily. Daniel had captured what the aliens said was uncatchable, and he had done it using nothing but observation and patience and knowledge, passed down through generations of Cherokee hunters. The biodome's entrance opened and Ambassador Krell entered, followed by several council members. They stared at the captured creature, and then at Daniel, who stood calmly beside it, covered in mud and sweat. The Arbiter's voice came through the translation device, and for once it did not sound smug or dismissive. The Arbiter declared that the first trial was passed and that Daniel had proven he could hunt prey that galactic technology could not catch, but the Arbiter also made it clear that one success did not guarantee Daniel's freedom. There would be more trials because the Council needed to be certain that his other claims were true. Daniel nodded his acceptance because he had expected this. He had bought himself more time and proven that human wisdom had value. Now he needed to survive the next challenge and the one after that. He needed to keep proving himself until even the most skeptical council members had to admit that humanity deserved respect. The second trial would test his healing abilities, and Daniel already knew it would be harder than the first. The council chamber was filled with arguing voices when Daniel was brought before them again. Half the council members wanted to release him immediately because he had proven his worth by capturing the Shadow Stalker. The other half insisted that one successful demonstration meant nothing and could have been luck. The Arbiter called for silence and explained that there would be a second trial to settle the matter. This time, Daniel would have to prove his claim about healing. They brought forward a Varath scientist named Zin, who looked like a person made entirely of living crystal. The Varath were one of the most advanced species in the galaxy, and their bodies were composed of complex crystalline structures that could conduct energy and process information faster than most organic brains. But Zin was dying, and all the advanced medicine of galactic civilization could not save them. Daniel listened as the medical team explained what had happened. Zin had been conducting experiments with temporal radiation, which was energy that could affect the flow of time itself. Something had gone wrong during the experiment, and Zin had been exposed to a massive dose of this radiation. Now their crystalline body was aging and regressing randomly with no pattern or control. One moment a section of crystal would age thousands of years and begin to crack. The next moment it would regress to an infantile state and lose all structure. The cascade was spreading through Zin's entire body and causing their organs to fail one by one. The medical team had tried everything they knew. They had used quantum stabilizers to try to lock Zin's molecular structure in place, but the temporal radiation was too strong. They had attempted to replace damaged sections with artificial crystal, but the new material quickly became infected by the same instability. They had even consulted with the greatest medical minds from a dozen species, and all had reached the same conclusion. Zin had perhaps 5 or 6 days before the cascade reached their central core and killed them. There was no cure and no hope. Daniel looked at the dying Varath and felt a deep sadness. Zin's crystalline eyes met his, and Daniel saw fear there despite the alien nature of their form. Fear was universal, and so was the desire to live. Daniel asked if he could examine Zin more closely, and the council granted permission. He approached the Varath carefully and studied their crystalline structure in the light. He touched Zin's surface gently and felt the vibrations that ran through the crystal. He listened to the sounds Zin's body made as energy flowed through fracturing channels. Then Daniel began asking questions that made the medical team exchange confused glances. He asked what Zin ate, and the doctors explained that Varath consumed mineral solutions rich in specific elements. He asked about the chemical composition of the Varath homeworld's atmosphere. He asked what temperature Zin preferred and whether they slept in light or darkness. He asked what songs the Varath people sang and what stories they told their children. The medical team provided data, but they did not understand why a primitive human wanted cultural information instead of medical details. Daniel spent the next day in meditation, and the aliens, monitoring him, thought he had given up. But he was not giving up. He was remembering everything his grandmother had taught him about healing. She had always said that healing was not just about treating symptoms, but about understanding the whole person. Every illness existed in context, and you could not cure the body without considering the spirit, and the environment and the life that person lived. The galactic doctors treated Zin like a broken machine that needed fixing, but Daniel saw them as a living being who needed balance. On the second day, Daniel requested specific materials. He asked for mineral samples from the Vareth homeworld, which the station had in its geological collection. He asked for water that had been collected from Earth, specifically spring water from mountain sources. He asked for access to the station's sonic laboratory, which was a facility used to study sound waves and frequencies. The council found these requests strange, but granted them because they were curious about what Daniel planned to do. Daniel ground the minerals into a fine powder using primitive stone tools he fashioned himself. He mixed this powder with the earth spring water while speaking prayers in Cherokee that his grandmother had taught him. The medical team laughed because mixing rocks and water seemed like pure superstition. But Daniel was not performing superstition. He was creating a solution that contained trace elements from Zin's homeworld, suspended in a medium that came from a younger planet with different properties. The combination would interact in ways the doctors had never considered. Then Daniel took this mixture to the sonic laboratory and exposed it to specific sound frequencies. He spent hours experimenting with different tones and vibrations until he found a frequency that made the mixture resonate in a particular way. The frequency matched the natural harmonic vibration of healthy Vareth crystal, as documented in the station's scientific database. Daniel was essentially creating a template that would remind Zin's body what stability felt like at a molecular level. The medical team protested when Daniel said he wanted to apply this mixture to Zin's crystalline skin. They called it primitive nonsense and warned that he might make the condition worse. But Ambassador Krell intervened and reminded them that the council had agreed to let Daniel try his methods. Zin also spoke up in a voice like chiming bells and said they were dying anyway, so what harm could it do? If this strange human thought he could help, then Zin was willing to try anything. Daniel approached Zin with a bowl containing the mixture he had prepared. The liquid glowed faintly in the light and smelled of minerals and mountain water. He dipped his fingers in the bowl and began applying the paste to Zin's crystalline surface, while humming a healing song his grandmother had taught him. The song was in Cherokee, and the words spoke of balance and renewal and the eternal cycle of all living things. Daniel hummed this song and spread the paste in patterns that followed the natural growth lines of Zin's crystal structure. The medical team watched with skeptical expressions, but as minutes passed, their skepticism turned to confusion and then to shock. The temporal fluctuations in Zin's body were slowing down. The random aging and regression that had been cascading out of control began to stabilize. The doctors ran every scan they had, and all the equipment confirmed what their eyes were seeing. Zin's crystalline structure was responding to the treatment and beginning to heal. Daniel continued his work for several hours. He applied more paste and hummed more songs and spoke to Zin in soft tones about balance and healing. He told Zin stories about the mountains of Earth and the Cherokee belief that everything in nature seeks equilibrium. He explained that temporal radiation had pushed Zin out of balance with their own nature, but that balance could be restored by reminding the body of its natural state. The paste provided the chemical template, and the sonic frequency provided the energetic template, and Daniel's songs provided the spiritual template. Together they created a complete healing that addressed body and energy and spirit. By the end of the day, Zin's temporal fluctuations had stopped completely. The cascade that had been spreading through their body had been halted. The doctors ran more tests and could not find any sign of the instability that had been killing Zin just hours before. They checked and rechecked their equipment because they could not believe what they were seeing. A simple mixture of minerals and water combined with sound and song had accomplished what quantum medicine and advanced technology had failed to do. Zin stood up from the medical bed, and their crystalline body rang like a bell with pure, clear tones. They looked at Daniel with eyes that sparkled with gratitude and asked how he had known what to do. Daniel explained that his grandmother had taught him that every living thing has a natural state of balance, and that healing is about helping that thing return to balance. The Vareth doctors had been trying to fight the temporal radiation with force, but Daniel had instead worked with Zin's body to remind it of what health felt like. It was a different approach based on wisdom instead of technology. Ambassador Krell stood before the council and declared the second trial passed. Daniel had healed what galactic science could not cure. The council chamber filled with murmuring voices, and Daniel could see that opinions were shifting. More council members now believed that humanity possessed knowledge worth preserving, but the Arbiter was not yet convinced. The Arbiter announced that there would be one more trial, because Daniel had claimed he could weave patterns that computers could not replicate. If Daniel passed this final test, then the council would have to acknowledge that humanity deserved recognition as more than a primitive species. Daniel was exhausted from the work of healing, but he agreed to the third trial. He had come too far to give up now. He had proven he could hunt, and he had proven he could heal. Now he would have to prove that human hands could create what alien machines could not. As he was led back to his quarters, he thought about his grandmother's hands weaving baskets by firelight. She had made beauty from simple materials, and her patterns had held meaning that went beyond mere decoration. Daniel would need to channel that same spirit if he was going to survive the final challenge and win his freedom. The third trial came from the archivists of the Eternal Library, who were beings that existed primarily as patterns of energy stored inside vast computer networks. They had given up physical bodies long ago, and now lived as pure information flowing through crystalline processors. The archivists were some of the most advanced beings in the galaxy, and they were also the most skeptical of Daniel's claims. They could not imagine how a primitive human who worked with his hands could possibly solve problems that existed in the digital realm. Challenge they presented seemed impossible even to Ambassador Krell, who had become Daniel's strongest supporter on the council. The station's central computer network had become infected with something called a cascading logic virus. This virus was not like the simple computer viruses of Earth. It was a sophisticated program that fed on algorithmic solutions and grew stronger every time someone tried to fix it with computational methods. Every patch the technicians applied only gave the virus more code to consume and evolve. The virus was spreading through the memory banks that contained irreplaceable cultural records from over 1,000 species. There were songs that had been sung for millions of years, and stories that predated galactic civilization, and art that represented the peak achievements of extinct races. All of this knowledge was stored in the central network, and the virus was consuming it section by section. The archivists estimated that within 36 hours everything would be destroyed. Centuries of accumulated wisdom would be lost forever. The technicians had tried everything they could think of. They had attempted to isolate infected sections, but the virus jumped through quantum connections faster than they could build walls. They had tried to rewrite the core programming, but the virus adapted to every change. They had even considered shutting down the entire network, but that would also destroy all the data they were trying to save. The situation seemed hopeless, and the archivists were resigned to losing their precious collection. Daniel listened to this explanation and asked to see how the virus behaved. The technicians brought him to a viewing chamber where holographic displays showed the virus moving through the network. Daniel watched the patterns of light that represented data being consumed and transformed. The virus moved in waves that pulsed and flowed like water finding channels through rock. It grew in fractal patterns that branched and merged and split again. The more Daniel watched, the more he realized something the digital beings had missed. The virus was not behaving like a computer program at all. It was behaving like a living organism following instinctual patterns that had nothing to do with logic. The archivists saw the virus as corrupted code that needed to be debugged, but Daniel saw it as something more fundamental. The virus was moving like water seeks the lowest point, or like roots seek nutrients in soil. It was following paths of least resistance and spreading according to principles that were older than computers or technology. Daniel asked if he could see the physical infrastructure of the network. The technicians found this request odd, because the problem existed in software, not hardware, but they agreed to show him. They led him through corridors deep in the station's core where massive processors hummed and fiber optic cables glowed with flowing data. Daniel studied this infrastructure carefully and began to understand the relationship between the digital realm and the physical structures that supported it. He requested materials that seemed to have nothing to do with computer repair. He asked for fiber optic cables, including ones that had been removed during previous repair attempts. He asked for quantum processors that had been damaged and replaced. He asked for access to the physical junction points where different sections of the network connected. He asked for tools as simple as wire cutters and tape. The technicians exchanged confused glances but provided what he requested. Daniel began to work, and the archivists watched through the monitoring systems in growing bewilderment. He was not writing code or reprogramming anything. Instead, he was physically manipulating the network infrastructure using his hands. He cut fiber optic cables and reconnected them in new patterns. He removed certain processors and replaced them with damaged ones he had requested. He created physical loops and pathways that seemed to serve no logical purpose. What Daniel was doing looked like random destruction to the technicians, but it was actually based on principles his grandmother had taught him about basket weaving. Every basket began with understanding how materials wanted to flow. You did not force reeds into shapes they resisted. Instead, you worked with their natural tendency to bend and twist. You created patterns that distributed stress evenly, and channels that allowed movement while maintaining structure. Daniel was applying these same principles to the network. The virus wanted to flow and consume, so Daniel gave it paths to follow. But these paths did not lead to more data. Instead, they led through the damaged processors he had carefully positioned. These processors had flaws that created recursive loops in the data stream. The virus flowing through them would find itself returning to the same point over and over. The damaged processors acted like knots in a basket that redirected force back on itself. Daniel wove the fiber optic cables in patterns that resembled traditional Cherokee basket designs. He created spirals that drew the virus inward and branches that split its attention in multiple directions. He made loops that fed back on themselves and channels that led nowhere. The entire structure was a trap made of light and data, but guided by principles that were thousands of years old. The technicians tried to stop him several times because they thought he was making the situation worse. But Ambassador Krell ordered them to stand down and let Daniel work. Krell had learned to trust the humans' unconventional methods. As hours passed, the pattern Daniel was creating became clear. He was not fighting the virus with force. He was guiding it into a trap of its own making. The virus followed its instincts and flowed through the pathways Daniel had created. It consumed data from the damaged processors and grew stronger, just as it had always done. But the data it was consuming contained subtle errors that accumulated over time. The virus was adapting to damaged information and becoming corrupted by its own success. Daniel was teaching the virus to destroy itself by feeding it poison disguised as food. As the virus concentrated in the areas Daniel had prepared, he made his final move. He introduced a simple recursive loop into the infected sections. This loop was so primitive that the sophisticated virus did not recognize it as a threat. It was like a nursery rhyme compared to the complex algorithms the virus had evolved to counter. But simplicity was the key. The virus had grown so complex that it could not process something so basic. The recursive loop caused the virus to reference itself in an infinite cycle that collapsed its structure from within. The technicians watched their displays in shock as the virus began to disintegrate. The infection that had resisted every computational solution was being destroyed by physical manipulation and simple logic. Within hours, the virus was completely eliminated. The memory banks were safe and the cultural records of 1,000 species were preserved. Daniel had saved the eternal library using nothing but his hands and knowledge passed down through generations of Cherokee basket weavers, the archivists, manifested in the chamber as glowing forms of pure energy. They had no faces, but Daniel could sense their amazement. They had existed as digital beings for so long that they had forgotten the importance of physical connection. They had treated the network as pure abstraction and missed the fact that even digital information required physical substrate. Daniel had seen what they could not see because he understood that everything existed in relationship between physical and non-physical realms. Ambassador Krell stood before the council and declared the third trial passed. Daniel had woven solutions that computers could not replicate because he understood patterns at a fundamental level that went beyond algorithmic thinking. The council chamber filled with voices, and this time even the arbiter seemed impressed. Daniel had proven all three of his claims. He could hunt and heal and weave. He had demonstrated that human wisdom had value that matched or exceeded galactic technology, but proving his worth was only the beginning. The council now faced a larger question that made them deeply uncomfortable. If one human from a supposedly primitive world could accomplish all this, what did that say about humanity as a whole? What did it say about the tier system that classified species based only on their technology? What did it say about the thousands of other worlds that had been dismissed as primitive and unworthy of contact? Daniel had opened a door that the council could not easily close, and the implications terrified them as much as they inspired them. The council chamber erupted into chaos the moment the third trial was declared complete. Voices from dozens of species filled the space with arguments that the translation devices struggled to convert into coherent meaning. Some council members demanded Daniel's immediate release, while others insisted that his success only made him more dangerous. The arbiter called for order, but the debates continued for hours as the assembled species struggled with implications that challenged everything their civilization was built upon. The faction demanding Daniel's execution was led by the Vareth Elder Council, who saw his very existence as a threat to their philosophical framework. The Vareth had built their entire society on the belief that technological advancement represented the only true path to enlightenment. Their religion taught that consciousness evolved through the mastery of increasingly complex tools, and that species who remained tied to organic wisdom were spiritually inferior. Daniel's success in solving problems that Vareth technology could not solve undermined this core belief and threatened the foundations of their culture. 1. Vareth elder named Vex spoke with passion about the danger of allowing primitive methods to gain legitimacy in galactic society. Vex argued that if the council acknowledged Daniel's wisdom as equal to technological achievement, then they would be opening the door to regression and chaos. Species throughout the galaxy might abandon their pursuit of advancement and return to primitive superstitions. Progress would halt and civilization would crumble. Better to eliminate this one human than risk the collapse of everything they had built over millions of years. But Ambassador Krell and the Shortened Days Alliance argued just as passionately for a different interpretation. Krell explained that Daniel had not defeated technology but rather demonstrated a different kind of knowledge that complemented technological solutions. The galaxy had become so focused on computational thinking that it had forgotten other ways of understanding the universe. Daniel's methods were not primitive, but rather sophisticated in ways that did not require machines. His success proved that organic wisdom deserved recognition and study, rather than dismissal. Other species began sharing their own observations and experiences that supported Krell's argument. An insectoid representative from the Threx colonies mentioned that their own ancestors had possessed abilities that modern Threx had lost in the pursuit of technology. An energy being from the Luminal Collective spoke about how their species had once been corporeal and remembered songs that could heal in ways their current medical technology could not match. A crystalline merchant who traded across the galaxy told stories of visiting primitive worlds, where the inhabitants displayed creativity and problem-solving abilities that seemed almost magical. Compared to more advanced species, the council realized they were facing a question far bigger than what to do with one human prisoner. They were confronting a fundamental assumption about how intelligence and civilization should be measured. The tier system that classified species based on technology had been in place for thousands of years. It determined which worlds received contact and which were left isolated. It shaped trade relationships and diplomatic status and even military alliances. If that system was flawed, then the entire structure of galactic society might need to be reconsidered. A third faction emerged during these debates called the Observationists, who proposed a compromise. They suggested keeping Daniel as a living specimen for study, rather than executing him or releasing him. He would be housed comfortably and treated well, but would spend his life helping galactic scientists understand human cognition and organic wisdom. This faction argued that Daniel represented a unique opportunity to learn from a species that still retained knowledge most civilizations had lost. They could study his methods and perhaps integrate organic wisdom into their technological framework. Daniel listened to aliens debate his fate as though he were an interesting puzzle rather than a person with thoughts and feelings. He stood in chains again because the council had decided he might be dangerous if allowed to move freely. He heard himself described as a specimen and a subject and a resource, but rarely as a being with rights. The translation device conveyed the emotional content of the debates, and Daniel understood that even those who wanted to study him saw him primarily as a source of information rather than as an individual who deserved freedom. That night in his cell, Daniel finally broke down. He had held himself together through the trials and demonstrations because he needed to stay focused on survival. But now that the immediate danger had passed, the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He was millions of miles from Earth and had no way to get home even if the council agreed to release him. His daughter Katie would be 15 now and probably believed her father was dead. His brother Jacob had certainly given up the search after months of finding nothing. Daniel's entire life had been stolen, and even if he survived, he could never get it back. He wept silently in the darkness and thought about everything he had lost. He thought about morning coffee on his porch, watching deer emerge from the forest. He thought about teaching Katie to track animals and identify plants. He thought about sitting around fires with Jacob, telling stories their grandfather had told them. He thought about the smell of rain on mountain soil, and the sound of wind through pine trees and the feel of cold stream water on his hands. All of that was gone and might never return. Ambassador Krell visited him during this dark moment. The alien's fur shifted through colors that Daniel's translator said indicated sadness and empathy. Krell sat outside the cell and spoke quietly about understanding loss, because the shortened Days Alliance was composed of species who had lost their homeworlds to various disasters. They knew what it meant to be cut off from everything familiar. Krell admitted that despite everything Daniel had accomplished, the Council would likely choose observation over freedom because bureaucracies feared change more than they valued justice. But Krell also told Daniel there might be one more chance. If Daniel could demonstrate something so valuable that every species on the Council would immediately benefit, then they could not justify keeping him imprisoned. The Council would have to recognize humanity as equals and establish proper first contact protocols with Earth. This would mean Daniel could eventually go home, even if it took time to arrange. The key was finding something that transcended individual achievements and offered universal value to galactic civilization. Daniel wiped his eyes and considered this possibility. He had already proven he could hunt and heal and weave, but those were individual skills that benefited specific situations. What could he offer that would be useful to every species, regardless of their biology or technology? What knowledge did humanity possess that was truly universal? He thought back to his grandmother's teachings and the stories his grandfather had told. He thought about Cherokee philosophy and the way his people had understood the world for thousands of years. Then Daniel realized what he needed to share. It was not a specific technique or method, but rather a way of thinking that had allowed humans to thrive on Earth, despite lacking advanced technology. It was an approach to problems that emphasized connection and balance and understanding context. It was wisdom about how to live in harmony with complex systems, rather than trying to dominate them through force. This was something every species could use regardless of their level of technology, because it addressed fundamental questions about existence and relationship. Daniel asked Krell to arrange one more demonstration before the Council. This time he would not prove a specific skill, but rather teach them something that would change how they approached every challenge they faced. Krell was skeptical because teaching seemed less impressive than dramatic demonstrations of hunting or healing. But Daniel insisted that this was the only way to win his freedom and potentially change humanity's status in the galaxy. After a long conversation, Krell agreed to petition the Council for one final opportunity. The next morning, Daniel stood before the Council again and proposed his demonstration. He would teach them a human concept that would benefit all of them and help solve problems they currently faced. The Arbiter seemed annoyed at this new request, but several Council members were curious enough to support giving Daniel one more chance. The vote was close, but it passed. Daniel would have one day to teach the assembled species something valuable enough to justify humanity's recognition as galactic equals. If he failed, then the Council would decide between execution and permanent observation. Everything now depended on whether Daniel could communicate wisdom that transcended the barriers of species and culture and technology. The Great Assembly Hall was filled with representatives from 40 different species when Daniel stood at the center to begin his teaching. The chamber was massive and circular, with seating that rose in tiers around a central platform. Beings of every imaginable form watched him with eyes and sensors and organs he had no names for. Some floated in containment fields, while others stood on legs or tentacles or stranger appendages. The diversity was overwhelming, but Daniel forced himself to focus on his purpose. He was not here to be intimidated, but to share something that could change everything. Daniel began by asking a simple question. He requested that each species representative describe their greatest unsolved problem. The Arbiter initially protested this approach because it seemed like a waste of time, but Ambassador Krell argued that Daniel should be allowed to teach in his own way. The Council agreed, and representatives began speaking one by one. Their problems varied wildly in nature and scope, but Daniel listened carefully to every single one. The Vareth spoke about resource depletion on their colony worlds. They had expanded across dozens of planets but kept encountering the same pattern, where resources that seemed abundant quickly became scarce once extraction began. Their computational models could not predict these failures, and colonies kept collapsing despite careful planning. The Vareth were frustrated because their technology should have solved this problem, but somehow kept missing critical factors. The archivists described their struggle with data decay in their oldest memory banks. Information that had been stored for millions of years was gradually losing coherence in ways they could not prevent. They had tried copying data to new storage systems, but the decay seemed to follow the information itself, rather than being tied to physical degradation. The archivists feared losing knowledge that predated their civilization and could never be recovered. The insectoid Threx talked about instability in their frontier settlements. New colonies would be established with careful planning and adequate resources, but within a generation, they would fragment into competing factions. The Threx could not understand why their hive-based social structure that worked perfectly on their homeworld kept failing when transplanted to new environments. They had tried everything from genetic modification to social engineering, but the problem persisted. Other species shared similar stories of problems that resisted technological solutions. Aquatic species could not maintain stable populations in artificial habitats despite perfect water chemistry. A silicon-based species struggled with communication breakdowns between their networked consciousness nodes. A species of living gas could not establish permanent settlements because their young kept dispersing before reaching maturity. Each problem seemed unique and unrelated to the others. Daniel listened to them all and then he smiled because he finally understood what the galaxy had forgotten. These beings had become so advanced and so specialized that they had lost sight of fundamental connections. They saw each problem in isolation and tried to solve it with targeted technological solutions. They never stepped back to see the patterns that linked everything together. They had forgotten how to think holistically about existence and relationship. He began his teaching by introducing a Cherokee concept his grandmother had explained to him many times. The word was duivkta, which meant something like balance or harmony, but really encompassed a much larger idea about how everything in the universe was connected. Daniel explained that Cherokee wisdom taught that nothing existed in isolation. Every being and every action and every event was part of a web of relationships that extended in all directions. To solve any problem, you had to understand not just the thing itself, but everything it touched and everything that touched it. The council members shifted, restlessly because this seemed like primitive philosophy, rather than practical knowledge. But Daniel continued by showing them how duivkta applied to the specific problems they had described. He used the station's holographic system to create visual representations that even non-human minds could understand. He showed them something they had never considered, because they were too focused on their own perspectives. He took the Vareth resource depletion problem and asked them to describe how Threx social structures worked. The Vareth were confused by this question because what did insect hive organization have to do with mining colonies? But Daniel guided them through an analysis that revealed surprising connections. The Threx maintained stability through constant communication and adaptation to changing conditions. Their settlements only failed when they tried to impose rigid structures from their homeworld, instead of allowing local adaptation. The same principle applied to Vareth resource extraction. The Vareth were failing because they approached each planet as a resource to be exploited according to predetermined plans. They never adapted their methods to local conditions or considered how their extraction affected the broader planetary ecosystem. Daniel showed them that resources were not just materials in the ground, but parts of living systems that responded to disruption. If they applied Threx principles of adaptive communication to their resource management, they could work with planetary systems instead of against them. Then Daniel addressed the archivist data decay problem using principles from Vareth crystalline biology. The archivists existed as pure information, but Vareth existed as structured crystal that required specific conditions to maintain stability. Daniel suggested that information might have similar needs for structure and environment. The data decay might not be a technical problem, but rather information, trying to exist in conditions that did not support its nature. If archivists studied how Vareth maintained crystalline coherence, they might find ways to provide better environments for ancient, information. Daniel continued this process for hours and demonstrated how every species problem could be approached using wisdom from other species. He showed them that the diversity of the galactic community was not a challenge to be managed, but a resource to be celebrated. Each species had evolved unique ways of understanding reality, and those different perspectives were exactly what was needed to solve problems that resisted single perspective thinking. But Daniel went further than just solving individual problems. He taught them about the human approach to understanding that came from living on a planet where survival required cooperation and adaptation. He explained that humans had thrived not because they were the strongest or fastest or smartest species on Earth, but because they learned to see connections and build relationships. Humans understood that a successful hunt required knowledge of plants and weather and animal behavior and terrain. Everything connected to everything else. He showed them how Cherokee basket weaving embodied this principle of connection. Every strand in a basket supported every other strand, and the pattern distributed force across the entire structure. If you pulled on one strand, the entire basket responded. Cherokee hunters understood that animals were not separate from their environment, but expressions of it. Cherokee healers knew that illness was not just physical, but involved spirit and community and place. All of this was Duyfkta in practice. The assembly hall grew quiet as Daniel's teaching reached its conclusion. He had demonstrated something that transcended technology and biology and culture. He had shown them a way of thinking that any intelligence could apply regardless of their form or origin. The principle of Duyfkta, of understanding connection and seeking balance, was universal because it addressed the fundamental nature of reality itself. Everything existed in relationship, and ignoring those relationships led to problems that technology alone could not solve. Ambassador Krell stood and spoke in a voice that trembled with emotion. The alien declared that Daniel had just given the galaxy something more valuable than any technological advancement. He had reminded them of wisdom they had lost in their pursuit of specialization and control. He had shown them how to think differently about every challenge they faced. This was not primitive superstition, but sophisticated understanding that complemented and enhanced technological capability. Other council members began standing as well. The crystalline Vareth, who had demanded Daniel's execution, now bowed with sounds like chiming bells that Daniel's translator said meant profound respect. The energy being archivist manifested in forms that pulsed with patterns indicating gratitude and recognition. The insectoid Threx representative performed a dance that communicated acceptance and alliance in their culture. One by one, the representatives of 40 species acknowledged what Daniel had taught them. The arbiter called for a vote on humanity's classification. The question was whether humans should remain classified as Tier 7 primitives or be elevated to Tier 2 status, which would grant them full galactic citizenship and immediate first contact. The vote was not unanimous because some species still feared the implications of acknowledging organic wisdom as equal to technological achievement. But the majority recognized that Daniel had proven humanity possessed knowledge the galaxy desperately needed. The vote carried, and Earth was officially recognized as a Tier 2 civilization worthy of contact and respect. Daniel felt tears running down his face as the vote was announced. The celebration of humanity's new status lasted only a few hours before Daniel began to understand the complications that came with his victory. He had won freedom and recognition for his species, but freedom was far more complex than simply being released from captivity. The council informed him that he could not simply return to Earth and resume his old life. First contact with humanity required careful planning, and Daniel would need to serve as his species' first official ambassador until proper diplomatic channels could be established. Ambassador Krell explained the situation during a private meeting in quarters much more comfortable than the cell Daniel had occupied. The galactic community had protocols for first contact that had been developed over millions of years and refined through countless encounters with new species. These protocols existed to minimize cultural shock and prevent the kind of social disruption that could destroy civilizations. Earth would be contacted, but the process would take months or even years to complete properly. Daniel listened to this explanation with growing anxiety because months or years meant his daughter would grow up without him. Katie was 15 now, and by the time he returned home, she might be in college or starting her own life. He would miss her high school graduation and her first job and all the small moments that made up a life. Jacob would have grieved for him and moved on, and the space Daniel had occupied in his brother's life would have been filled by new relationships and experiences. Coming home after so long would mean returning to a world that had learned to exist without him. But there were even more difficult questions to answer before Daniel could think about going home. The council needed to decide what information to share with Earth and what to withhold. The truth about galactic civilization would cause massive upheaval in human society. Governments would panic at the realization that Earth had been observed and evaluated without their knowledge or consent. Religious institutions would struggle with the existence of thousands of intelligent species and the implications for their teachings about humanity's special place in creation. The social and economic order would be disrupted in ways that could cause more harm than good. Some council members argued for complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. They believed that withholding information was a form of manipulation that violated the principles of respect and equality that had led to humanity's recognition. Other members insisted that gradual disclosure was more ethical because it would give human society time to adapt without collapsing. The debates continued for days, and Daniel found himself caught between competing visions of how to handle his own species. Daniel spent long hours in meditation trying to decide what he believed was right. His Cherokee upbringing had taught him that honesty was sacred and deception was corrosive to relationships. But he also understood that truth without context could cause harm, and that wisdom sometimes meant knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. He thought about what his grandmother would advise and realized she would tell him to consider the web of relationships and consequences that extended from every choice. Finally, Daniel proposed a compromise that drew on his teaching about duivkta and balance. He suggested beginning with subtle contact rather than dramatic revelation. Earth would receive information about galactic civilization gradually through multiple channels. Scientists would detect anomalies that suggested intelligent life beyond Earth. Governments would receive anonymous communications that hinted at larger realities. Cultural leaders would have dreams and visions that prepared them for contact. The truth would emerge organically rather than being imposed suddenly. The council debated this approach and eventually agreed to a modified version of Daniel's plan. First contact would occur in stages over approximately 1 Earth year. Daniel would return home, but he would carry the burden of knowing things he could not yet share. He would help prepare humanity for contact by speaking about balance and connection, and the importance of seeing beyond immediate circumstances. He would plant seeds that would help his species understand their place in a larger community when the time came. During the weeks of planning and preparation, Daniel became something unexpected. He transformed from prisoner to celebrity across the station. Scientists from dozens of species requested meetings to learn his methods and understand his way of thinking. Some wanted practical instruction in tracking or healing or pattern recognition. Others simply wanted to understand how a human mind worked because they had never encountered organic intelligence that approached problems the way Daniel did. A young Vareth named Zen approached Daniel one evening with a request that surprised him. Zen had been part of the faction demanding Daniel's execution because his success threatened Vareth philosophy and religion. But watching Daniel teach about connection and balance had affected Zen deeply. The young Vareth now wanted to learn everything Daniel could share because Zen had begun questioning the beliefs that their entire society was built upon. Daniel agreed to teach Zen, and their sessions became some of the most meaningful interactions Daniel experienced on the station. Teaching Zen reminded Daniel that his imprisonment and trials had accomplished something far larger than saving his own life. He had planted seeds of change across multiple civilizations. The Vareth were beginning to question their reliance on pure technology. The archivists were exploring the relationship between information and physical substrate. The Threks were reconsidering how they approached colony organization. Dozens of species were starting to think differently about problems they had struggled with for generations. Daniel's influence rippled outward in ways he could barely comprehend. But this influence also frightened Daniel because he understood the danger he represented to his own species. If he returned to Earth with too much knowledge and too much authority, he might inadvertently damage the very culture that had shaped him. His Cherokee heritage had given him the tools to survive, but it had also taught him that some lessons must be learned through experience rather than being taught. If he tried to force humanity to think like galactic citizens before they were ready, he could destroy the Organic wisdom that made humans valuable in the first place. Daniel confided these fears to Ambassador Krell during one of their many conversations. Krell responded with unexpected wisdom that came from the aliens' own experience. The Shortened Days Alliance was composed of species who had lost their homeworlds and struggled to maintain their cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances. Krell explained that the key was not to choose between old ways and new ways, but to find balance that honored both. Daniel could return home changed but still connected to his roots. He could bring knowledge without imposing it. He could be a bridge without trying to force people across it. This conversation helped Daniel understand his role more clearly. He was not returning to Earth as a conqueror or a savior, but as a teacher and translator. He would help humans understand galactic civilization through the lens of Cherokee wisdom, and help galactic civilization understand humans through the same lens. He would be forever changed by his experiences, but those changes did not erase who he had been. He was still a Cherokee hunter who tracked deer through mountain forests. He was also now someone who had tracked shadow stalkers through alien biodomes and taught balance to crystalline beings and woven traps from fiber optic cables. The day finally came when preparations were complete and Daniel's departure was scheduled. He would travel aboard a diplomatic vessel that would return him to Earth under stealth conditions. The ship would land in a remote area of the Great Smoky Mountains where Daniel had been abducted. He would emerge alone and make his way back to civilization with a story about being lost in the wilderness for nearly a year. This cover story would be maintained until official first contact occurred months later. Daniel said goodbye to the beings who had become unexpected friends during his captivity. He thanked Zen for showing him that even those who had wanted him dead could change and grow. He embraced Zin, whose crystalline body had been healed by Daniel's methods, and who now studied Cherokee healing practices. He shared a moment of silence with the archivists who had learned that information needed context and connection, just like living beings. He gripped Ambassador Krell's strange fur-covered hand and thanked the alien for believing in him when belief seemed impossible. As Daniel boarded the diplomatic vessel, he felt the weight of two worlds settling on his shoulders. Behind him stretched an entire civilization of beings who now looked to humanity as teachers of wisdom they had forgotten. Ahead of him waited a planet full of people who did not yet know they were part of something infinitely larger than they had imagined. Daniel carried the responsibility of bridging these two realities without destroying either one. It was a burden heavier than any he had imagined when he set out to track deer through familiar mountains, what seemed like a lifetime ago. The diplomatic vessel moved through space in ways that Daniel's mind could barely comprehend, and within hours they were approaching Earth. Daniel stood at the observation window watching his home planet grow larger in the view screen. The blues and greens and whites of ocean and land and cloud looked exactly as he remembered from photographs, but seeing it from space made his chest ache with emotions he had no words for. This was humanity's cradle and his own personal home, and he had been torn away from it for 312 days. Now he was returning changed in ways that could never be undone. Ambassador Krell stood beside Daniel as Earth filled the view. The alien's fur glowed with colors that Daniel had learned meant deep respect mixed with sadness. Krell spoke quietly about how Daniel's presence had changed the galactic community in fundamental ways. The concept of balance and connection that Daniel had taught was being adopted by multiple species. The Verath were reconsidering their entire philosophical framework. The archivists were developing new approaches to information preservation based on Cherokee wisdom. The Threks were restructuring their colonial policies to allow for local adaptation rather than imposed uniformity. But Krell also warned Daniel about the burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Knowledge changed people in ways that could not be reversed. Daniel now knew things that would make him forever different from other humans. He would see connections that others missed and understand patterns that seemed invisible to those who had not traveled beyond Earth. He would be studied and questioned and doubted and celebrated in equal measure. People would demand that he share everything he knew, while others would accuse him of lying or madness. His normal life was over and could never be recovered. Daniel accepted this truth because he had already mourned the loss of his old life during the dark nights in his cell. The man who had set out to track deer through the Great Smoky Mountains was gone. The man returning to Earth carried wisdom that came with its own weight and responsibility. He thought about his grandmother, who had carried the burden of keeping Cherokee traditions alive through times when the outside world tried to erase them. She had understood that some knowledge was too important to keep silent about, even when speaking brought hardship. Daniel would follow her example. The vessel entered Earth's atmosphere using stealth technology that made it invisible to human detection systems. Daniel watched clouds part around them and mountains emerge below. The ship descended toward a remote valley in the Great Smoky Mountains that Daniel recognized immediately. He could see his old pickup truck parked where he had left it almost a year ago. The vehicle was covered in leaves and dirt and looked abandoned, but Jacob had maintained it somehow. His brother had never given up hope, even after months of searching had turned up nothing. The ship landed in a clearing that showed signs of being used as a base camp during the search. Daniel could see the remains of campfires and markers that indicated where search teams had coordinated their efforts. He felt tears running down his face as he realized how many people had looked for him and refused to believe he was gone. His community had not forgotten him, even when reason said they should. This knowledge filled him with gratitude and also guilt because he had been alive while they grieved. Ambassador Krell handed Daniel a small communication device that looked like an ordinary smartphone, but contained technology far beyond what Earth possessed. This device would allow Daniel to maintain contact with the galactic community during the preparation period before official first contact. Krell explained that Daniel could call for help if he needed it and could receive updates about the contact timeline. But Krell also reminded him that using the device carelessly could expose him to suspicion and danger from humans who would not understand what he had experienced. The ship's door opened, and Daniel stepped onto Earth soil for the first time in almost a year. The sensation of familiar gravity and air pressure felt like coming home after a long journey. He breathed in the smell of pine trees and mountain soil and morning dew. He felt the sun on his face and heard birds singing in the trees and felt wind moving through the valley. All of these sensations were so familiar and so precious that he stood frozen for a moment, simply experiencing them. The ship lifted silently behind him and vanished into the sky, leaving Daniel alone in the clearing. He walked slowly toward his truck and found that Jacob had indeed maintained it. The battery was charged and the tank was full, and there was a note under the windshield wiper written in his brother's handwriting. The note said that Jacob checked on the truck every week and would never stop hoping that Daniel would come back. Daniel folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, where it would stay close to his heart. But before leaving the clearing, Daniel needed to do something important. He built a small fire using methods his grandfather had taught him and sat beside it to offer prayers in Cherokee. He thanked the spirits of the mountains for protecting him during his absence. He asked for wisdom to carry the burden of knowledge he now possessed. He prayed for his daughter and brother and all the people of Earth, who would soon learn that they were not alone in the universe. He prayed for balance and connection and the strength to serve as a bridge between worlds. As Daniel sat by the fire, he heard a voice in his communicator. Ambassador Krell spoke one final time before official silence would be maintained until first contact. The alien asked if Daniel had any words that should be recorded for the historical archives, something that would mark this moment when a human returned from the stars carrying knowledge that would change everything. Daniel thought carefully about what he wanted to say and how he wanted his species to be remembered. He spoke first in Cherokee using words his grandmother
had taught him about balance and harmony,
and the sacred web that connected all living things. Then he repeated his words in English so that the galactic translation systems could record them properly. He said that humanity was ready to meet the galaxy. He said that humans hunted for wisdom and healed wounds and wove connections. He said that his people had survived the dawn that was meant to burn him, and now they walked toward the stars not as primitives seeking advancement, but as teachers with knowledge to share. He said that the Cherokee and all of humanity offered balance to the galaxy. Daniel extinguished the fire and climbed into his truck. The engine started smoothly and he began driving down the mountain road toward the small town where his brother lived. He practiced the story he would tell about being lost in the wilderness and surviving through hunting and foraging. The story was partially true and would explain his absence without revealing the larger truth. People would think he had been confused or injured and wandered for months before finding his way back. Some would believe him, while others would suspect something more complicated. Daniel accepted that he would spend the rest of his life walking the line between truth and necessary secrecy. As he drove through familiar forests, Daniel thought about what came next. In the coming months, he would reconnect with Katie and Jacob. He would try to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by his absence. He would speak at community gatherings about balance and connection without revealing the galactic context for these teachings. He would plant seeds that would help humanity understand their place in a larger community. When first contact finally occurred, he would serve as a bridge even though most people would not know what he was bridging. The town appeared ahead and Daniel saw people going about their normal lives completely, unaware that everything was about to change. They walked dogs and bought groceries and complained about traffic without knowing that beings of pure energy and living crystal and flowing mercury were watching their world with newfound respect. They lived their ordinary lives carrying wisdom about connection and creativity and adaptation that made them valuable to civilizations spanning the galaxy. Daniel's job was to help them understand this value when the time came. He parked in front of Jacob's house and sat for a moment gathering courage. His brother would be inside, probably getting ready for work, or maybe already gone for the day. Katie might be there visiting or might be at school. Daniel would knock on the door and see the shock on their faces when they recognized him. There would be tears and questions and disbelief and joy all mixed together. He would hold them close and try to explain where he had been without explaining anything real. He would be home but not truly home because part of him would always remain among the stars. Daniel stepped out of the truck and walked toward the house carrying the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. Behind him, invisible in orbit, the galactic community watched and waited. Ahead of him, humanity continued in ignorance for just a little while longer. The dawn had come exactly as the aliens had promised. But Daniel Whitehorse had not burned. Instead, he had lit a fire that would illuminate the path between Earth and the stars for generations to come. The story of how a Cherokee hunter saved himself with ancient wisdom and changed the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be civilized would be told for centuries across countless worlds. But for Daniel in this moment, only one thing mattered. He raised his hand to knock on his brother's door.